everyone. I'm Emma Varvalukas, Executive Director of the Progress Network. We're gathering together constructive public voices to see what progress we can make. And you can find out more about us at theprogressnetwork.org. And one of those voices is Robert Talisse. I'm here with him today. He's a Progress Network member. He's a professor of political philosophy at Vanderbilt University. He's just written a book called Overdoing Democracy: Why We Must Put Politics in Its Place. And I have to give this book a really heartfelt plug because, you know, if you hear the term political philosophy and you get excited, this book is for you. But if you hear the term political philosophy and you want to run in the opposite direction, this book is also for you. It's really readable. It's really accessible. And I think that it sort of illuminates a lot of problems that we've been feeling in our daily life here in the United States. And it also is presenting solutions to those problems. So Bob, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Emma. It's really great to meet you.
Yeah. So we're going to do kind of like the way the book is set up is there's a 3-part diagnosis of the issue, and then the solution comes afterward. So let's get into the problems.
Right.
The book is called Overdoing Democracy, which if you don't know what you mean by that, maybe you think, oh, this guy wants a little less democracy. He wants a little more monarchy, a little more aristocracy, you know. But obviously that's not what you mean. So what do you mean by we're overdoing democracy?
Good. So, you know, there are different ways of thinking about how it might be possible to have too much of a good thing. And in lots of other contexts, we recognize that good things can be overdone. Now, let me give one very clear example and then suggest that democracy is slightly different from the example I'm about to cite, but is subject to overdoing it a slightly different way. So think about cheesecakes. Cheesecake is the kind of good thing that is subject to overdoing on the model of what the economics profession and the philosophers call diminishing utility, which might be familiar to some people who are joining us. That is, with every bite of the cheesecake, the subsequent bite becomes a little bit less pleasing, up to the point where the very thought of an additional bite might even be positively displeasing. Now, democracies are not cheesecakes. So that's not my thesis, thankfully.
And that was it.
However, there's this different kind of overdoing that good things are subject to, what I call crowding out. That is, we can overdo a good thing when we pursue it in such a way or with such an intensity that our pursuit expels or dismisses from our lives other valuable things. And I want to suggest that democracy is one of these goods. That is, what the Overdoing Democracy book is about is how, when our political objectives and aims and aspirations become central to the entirety of our social lives together, not only do we become less good at performing the job of citizenship, but we also lose sight of some of the goods that democracy's value lies in delivering. Let me put it slightly differently. When we overdo democracy, we become less capable as citizens, and we also lose sight of what the point of democracy is. The point of democracy is not more democracy. The point of democracy is to create the social and political conditions under which individuals can pursue valuable lives that might have nothing at all to do with politics. When politics becomes the driving, consuming force organizing the whole of our lives together, we lose out on other kinds of social goods because we're so focused on pursuing our partisan objectives that other good things fall by the wayside. Other good things that it's part of democracy's value to help us secure. That's the thought. How's that?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me in that you're pursuing democracy with such a focus that everything else falls by the wayside, right? And you say you see that happening here in the United States, and you mentioned Britain, because of something called political saturation, which is that politics has seeped its way into everything.
Right.
And I think that's something that people feel right now for sure. But tell us a little bit about that, what political saturation is.
Sure. So one of the things that's one of the data points that people find shocking when they first hear me say it, but then think a second time and then say, oh, yeah, of course that's true. And now I'm just talking about the United States, although we can talk about some of the data about the UK and Britain, but I'm sorry, and Europe. But as our country, the United States, has become more diverse along all kinds of promising metrics, the local spaces you and I inhabit in our day-to-day lives have become more homogeneous. So as the country in the aggregate has become more diverse, the actual places we occupy socially and physically have become less diverse, in fact, more homogeneous. And the metric of homogeneity that is found in our local spaces has increasingly become organized around our partisan identities. Now, what that means is that, and we could start talking about particular examples, which are really interesting.
There were some in the book that hit home.
Right, the spaces you occupy in your day-to-day life, the consumer choices you make in your day-to-day life, which may or may not occur to you as being expressions of your political identity, nonetheless are heavily sorted, segregated according to partisan identity. So just to give a couple of obvious examples, Starbucks skews heavily liberal in its clientele. Dunkin' Donuts, these are two major coffee chains in the United States and elsewhere, Dunkin' Donuts skews heavily conservative. Whole Foods skews heavily liberal. Down here in the South, we've got Kroger. Kroger's clientele is heavily conservative, or skews heavily conservative. The kind of car you drive, this is not so unfamiliar to people, this sort of hybrid or pickup truck. The kind of car you drive is sorted in partisan ways. But not only that. Here are some less, perhaps surprising, some more surprising, less familiar ways in which our lives are sorted according to our partisan identities. Liberals tend to vacation on beaches. Conservative vacations tend to be about fishing.
I did think the beach was a nonpartisan space.
Right, good.
Guess I'm wrong.
Yeah. Beaches, no, I mean, these are trends. They're not about, particular beaches at particular times and who's particularly on them at a particular time. Given that there are COVID worries and all kinds of other ways in which we've been cooped up, I don't know if these trends are quite as strong right now as they tend to be overall. But here's another. The number of clocks in your home or workspace positively correlates with being conservative politically. So the more clocks, the more likely it is that you're conservative. Contrast that with the more maps in your home, the more likely you are to be liberal. Now, this in Nashville, there's some research that I saw recently about hot sauce brands. That there are certain brands of hot sauce that liberals tend to really like and conservatives tend to really dislike. So there are all kinds of ways in which the ordinary undertaking of our day-to-day lives have built within them these partisan divisions. And when we go about our everyday lives, when we're buying our groceries at the grocery store that we prefer, when we're buying our coffee at the coffee shop that we frequent, chances are that we are engaging in or operating within spaces that are increasingly likely to put us into social contact only with people who are politically much like ourselves, such that the chance of having an unplanned encounter with another person who is disinclined to affirm our political values is diminishing, right? That is, more and more of what we do, even when we don't see ourselves as acting politically, is already sorted according to partisan allegiances in these ways that are not always easy to detect. Now, in some cases, they are very easy to detect. Think about tote bags. The number of tote bags you have positively correlates with how liberal your politics are. We can tell an explanatory story about that tote bags are often connected to valuing the environment and recycling and reusability and various kinds of sustainability commitments. And so you can see how those who prioritize those kinds of social values are going to have more tote bags. They're going to need more tote bags. They don't use paper or plastic bags. Got it. But note that the tote bags themselves often come with messaging. They often say things on them. At Whole Foods, I don't know if this is true. I haven't been out of my apartment in a long time, so I don't know if this is still true. But the Whole Foods tote bags say "values matter," which, as a philosopher, strikes me as a tautology. But
a bit, yeah,
matter.
yeah,
Right? Yeah, it's a little bit weird, right? But MSNBC used to sell, I believe still does sell, tote bags that say, "This is who we are." And on the other side, it says, "Talk politics to me." That is, tote bags skew heavily liberal, and they often come with messaging that affirms a certain political profile in a way that's public. And so engaging in the behavior that matches my values, like sustainability, in doing that, I'm also publicly affirming and expressing those values in a way that signals very clearly to others where I stand politically. And so my social interactions are increasingly not only sorted and orchestrated by means of these background forces that put me more and more into touch only with people who are politically like me, but that behavior itself becomes expressive of my politics, such that people see me, just in looking, can tell politically where I'm coming from. And that invites certain kinds of interactions, discourages other kinds of interactions. It invites certain people to interact and discourages others from interacting. Like the bag that says "Talk politics to me" also tells you, gives you an indication of what I'm likely to say if you do, right? Which serves as a signal. Like, you want to have a certain kind of interaction with a stranger? This is the kind of interaction you're likely to have with this stranger, which again means our everyday activities more and more put us in touch only with people who are more or less politically members of our own tribe.
Okay, so point being that politics has sort of saturated our lifestyles down to our consumer choices, down to where we might go get coffee in the morning. And because, birds of a feather flock together, you're going to Starbucks, there's only other people who have your same political viewpoint. We're increasingly in these homogenous spaces. What's the issue? I mean, maybe it'd be nice to go have coffee and talk about environmentalism in the morning.
Sure.
Maybe I like that. What's the problem?
So good. I don't think that in and of itself, that is the problem. I mean, in fact, I would say, democracy needs there to be access to social spaces where politically like-minded individuals can interact and talk about the values that they share in common, because that's how political coalitions are built and political movements work. And in a democracy, political coalitions, political movements, political allegiances and alliances are what politics is about. So don't want to say that is in and of itself problematic. Here's the problem. we, as the kinds of creatures cognitively and socially that we are susceptible to a pretty robust cognitive and social dynamical phenomenon called belief polarization. Sometimes it's called group polarization, but let's stick with the former term. I think it captures better the phenomenon. Belief polarization is the regularity with which interactions among like-minded people transforms them into more extreme versions of themselves. Now, we know this sort of in an idiomatic way. We talk about groupthink and the yes man phenomenon. Sometimes we hear or ourselves are concerned about what in the popular idiom we call echo chambers and filter bubbles. And these are sort of ways of understand, or these are manifestations of this very robust cognitive phenomenon. When we subject ourselves, when our interactions occur only with people who affirm our views, we shift into being not only more confident in our views, but our views themselves shift into more radical versions. So we become not only more confident in our environmental beliefs, we become more extreme in our environmentalist commitments. By the way, this is not to say that the more extreme views are less likely to be true. That's not the point. The point is that we're moved towards more extreme views irrespective of what evidence there is to support them. Right? So the shift occurs according really to social dynamics and not to new and better information. Now, what that means then is that as we become more extreme versions of ourselves, which again, that might be a shift from one perspective in the right direction, because the more extreme view on a particular issue might be closer to being the truth on that particular issue.
I'm excited to go save the rainforests, and before I didn't care. Yeah,
that's
whatever
exactly right.
Maybe. Yeah.
Maybe, right. That's not the problem. The problem is this. As we shift into our more extreme selves, not only do we become more confident in ourselves and come to hold more extreme radical beliefs about the things we're committed to, we also come to adopt increasingly negative attitudes towards and beliefs about people with whom we disagree. That is, it's almost like the side view mirror on a car, right? You look into it, it even tells you, like, you're looking at things that are closer than they look, right? That is, as we shift into our more extreme selves, the people who we see as our political opposition start looking to us increasingly distorted, irrational, unreasonable, untrustworthy, benighted, in some cases even unpatriotic, dangerous.
Yeah, and in your book you even say in need of diagnosis and treatment, which I thought was really...
That's exactly it. We start seeing political disagreement itself as explicable in terms of the psychological incapacities and the emotional depravity of the people on the other side of the question. And that, I think, on almost anybody's view of democracy, that's troubling. Because one of the things that democracy is lots of things. When we're thinking about democracy, we're thinking all kinds of different thoughts about elections and campaigns and polling and kissing babies and shaking hands and all that stuff. But all of those manifestations of democratic politics are best explained by reference to a moral ideal, a social enterprise, the social enterprise and the moral ideal of self-government among equals. That is, part of what democracy is the commitment to the idea that a relatively stable, decent, and just society is possible among self-governing equals. And when there's self-governing equals, there's political disagreement. But when there's political disagreement, there's disagreement about big and important things like justice and dignity and autonomy and liberty. So when we disagree about those big, important issues, concepts, values, the tendency is to see the people on the other side as not merely wrong, not merely mistaken, but in the wrong, we might say. However, democracy is the moral requirement that we try to see those on the other side of big, important political questions as nonetheless are equals, that is, entitled to an equal say. The belief polarization phenomenon attacks those capacities. The belief polarization phenomenon leads us to see our political opposition as something less than our equals. Because, as you just put it, Emma, when we are in the grip of belief polarization, we start seeing our political opposition as ill, as in need of a diagnosis, not as in need of better arguments, reasons, sit down, let me try to convince you. When we're in the grip of the belief polarization phenomenon, we start seeing our political opponents as impervious to reason. And when we see them in that regard, it becomes harder and harder to see them as people who deserve an equal political say. And once we grow incapable of seeing our political opponents as entitled to an equal say, we're giving up, we're losing democracy, because that's the core of democracy. I might think you're wrong about the issues in a way that puts you in the wrong, but nonetheless, you get an equal say, and you don't merely get it, you're entitled to it because you're not my subordinate. That's the problem.
I think this is very resonant for people, and I can imagine people watching this and thinking to themselves, well, yeah, I do think that people who don't have the same political beliefs as me are a bit emotionally depraved. At the very least, they're completely unreasonable, and I don't want to hear what they have to say. And I think trying to tell people that there's something inherently, I guess, anti-democratic about that view seems like you're fighting an uphill battle here.
Yeah, it is. And but let me say this about one step up the steep incline, right? Goes like this. Part of the belief polarization phenomenon, part of what it does to us, as we shift into our more extreme selves, as we adopt the more negative evaluations and attitudes towards the people on the other side, we also lose our capacity to recognize differences among our political opponents. That is, as we shift into our more extreme selves, we come to adopt a conception of our political opposition that renders them monolithic and unified around a single, often the most extreme version of the opposing view. And so you can even see this play out in real time. If you ever go on YouTube and watch this kind of thing, like what happens when people who disagree about the Second Amendment try to talk to one another? Well, the person who advocates for stricter controls on gun ownership is heard by the adversary as wanting to take guns away from everybody. The person who is the advocate for the Second Amendment, who thinks, no, there shouldn't be restrictions on gun ownership, is heard as supporting people shooting other people, right? Or think about the discourse around police violence in the country that we're familiar with, we're all too familiar with these days, where the two sides hear one another always as advocating the most extreme and unnuanced version, right? If you're critical of the police for the way they engage with protesters, for the way that they engage with persons of color that are in the community that is within their jurisdiction, you are heard as being against cops, wanting to get rid of cops, and advocating violence against law enforcement as such. On the other hand, you want to say, well, wait a minute, right? Policing is a necessary feature of a open civil society. Go through the list. You're heard as being unwilling to recognize the validity of any possible critique of what in fact is happening in in lots of parts of the country, right? You're defending the police who killed George Floyd. Now, we lose the capacity to see one another, to see in our political discourse different nuances among our opposition, and treat the opposition only as the most extreme version, which is to say the uphill battle in part has the incline it does. Because if we're liberal, we think that conservatives all think the same thing. If we're conservative, we think liberals all think the same thing. And we think that those things are only what the most extreme among them thinks. And so it seems to us then, because of this phenomenon, there's not enough common ground for there to be productive discussion, because anybody who's not just like me is a whacked out extremist on the other side, and I already know what they're going to say. Right. That's part of the incline. But seeing that as itself the product of this very common cognitive phenomenon, I think, is a first step. It's not a cure. It's the first step. We're very good. Let me just say one last thing on this. We're very good at recognizing this phenomenon in play in our opponents. Whenever I give talks on this, people are like, oh yeah, those guys on the other side, they're radicalized. They're caught in their own filter bubble. And they're getting more extreme and more unreasonable. I see that this thing happens. Like, okay. Now let's just be philosophical for a second. Because that phenomenon is itself due to certain features of our sociality and our way of being cognitive creatures, why assume that you and your side is free of it?
Because my side is right. I'm correct.
That's the thought. That's the thought. And even if your side is right and correct, you're still subject to these forces, right? You still assign a greater level of confidence to your view than you should, right? Let me say one further thing about this, which I don't think comes up in the book, but is worth saying nonetheless. I think that we, as political thinkers, which we are all called to be by democracy, right? This is the thing that, democracy means we all have to be political philosophers or theorists to a certain degree, because we're all partners in governing.
We're participants, yeah.
Good. Mm-hmm. So one of the facts about us, particularly as political thinkers, that it strikes me as a kind of philosophical error, but very, very common, is the following. We infer from the fact that the people on the other side of the political spectrum from us have flawed and mistaken political ideas. And grant that they do. We infer from the fact that their ideas are flawed or mistaken that they're incapable of presenting us with good criticisms. That looks like an error to me. It's like, wait a minute, you could be wrong about politics. That doesn't mean you're an incompetent critic of what I think, even if what I think is true. Even true ideas face challenges and cogent criticism, even if they're true. This is an old John Stuart Mill kind of idea. It seems to me to be not only philosophically correct, but we have a hard time keeping ourselves mindful of the fact that you might be mistaken. That doesn't mean you can't be a good critic.
Right, because in this atmosphere of I'm seeing you as a crazy person, why would I think that you can be a good critic? Like, you're a crazy person, That's exactly right.
It's kind of a, I don't know if this is the right way to put it. It's an immature way of looking at the world, right? It's almost like a teenager's way of looking at the world. You're either for me or you're against me.
It's a very, if you fundamentally distrust the people in the country that you live in, it really does set the stage for a poor functioning democracy. If you really think that half of the country you live within is full of nutty people that you can't trust,
Sure.
But Bob, can you go for another 10 or 15 minutes?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay, good. So you mentioned police brutality, and and how we tend to assume that people on the other side are at the most extreme point. And I definitely saw this on Facebook recently where someone had commented, oh, all liberals want to do away with the police. And, I was like, I wonder if I should respond politely to this and just say, oh, I don't think that's what all liberals think. I think that is taking it a bit far. And I mention this because listening to this diagnosis, you might think that the solution that you are advocating for in the book is let's all come together, across a table and talk it out. Let's talk out our political differences. But that's actually not what you're saying the solution should be. So what is the solution that you're presenting?
Good. That's exactly right. But let me just say, I'm not opposed to efforts to help bridge partisan divides and heal divisions among different parties. I'm not opposed to that. What I want to claim is that even if those kinds of interventions are successful, they often are not, by the way, but even when they are successful, they're not sufficient. Because I think that the real, how we got to where we're at in the country is the product of this combination of political saturation and the belief polarization phenomenon, which reinforce each other. I think that the right thing that the thing that we need to do as a democratic society is desaturate our social lives. That doesn't mean that we have to, step back from politics or think that politics isn't important. No, we still have to be responsible democratic citizens and engage and participate and do all the things that democratic citizens have to do. So it's not a disengagement thesis. It's desaturation, which means this. If we want to perform well as democratic citizens, we sometimes have to find things to do together in which politics plays no role. We have to find ways to interact and cooperate in pro-social contexts where we're not suppressing our political differences or bracketing our partisan divides, but we're doing something in which politics just doesn't have a role, where politics is beside the point. Now, I suspect, I've given lots of talks on this, I know what, I can read the minds of the people who might be watching, who are just saying, what the heck is he talking about? Everything is politics. And I just want to suggest, I agree, everything is politics. That's a symptom of something. That's what I mean by overdoing democracy. When we can't even imagine a cooperative activity that is not itself the enactment or expression of our partisan identity, we've allowed politics to crowd out other kinds of social goods. And I want to suggest that is that's a deeper problem than it might even look. So let me just go back to the crowding out thought that we began with, Emma, and say this. I had a friend, and this is a true story. I had a friend who decided she was just going to achieve optimal physical fitness, and devoted from that moment, sort of went and devoted like herself to a very demanding exercise and nutrition regimen. And she achieved wonderful results. She didn't hurt herself. I mean, she did it all the right way. But the problem was that she lost touch with all of her friends. Right?
But she looked really good.
she looked really good. I'm sure she felt really good. I'm sure that, fitness has rewards all of its own. So not even denying that fitness is a good. But I am saying this. To see this person adopt this routine with such an intensity and single-minded focus, such that she never had time to go to the movies or to hang out or to have lunch even or to do talk on the phone. any of the things that those of us who were her friends used to regularly enjoy with her as ways of like keeping friendships going or maintaining good social relations with one's friends, all of that fell by the wayside. And I just want to suggest, there's a lot to be said, and I haven't filled in all details. I just want to suggest that the case of this person, it started to look like it was right to think that there was something to be diagnosed in the pursuit, that it looked more like an obsession and a compulsion than a valuing of something. Now, I want to suggest that part of what might lead us to think in this exercise example that the person in question is in the grip of an obsession is not the thought that, well, fitness just isn't that important. Fitness might be that important. It might be fully rational to think that fitness is really, really important in life. Not denying that. I want to say that what makes fitness the kind of good that it is that being fit enables us to pursue other good things, to do other worthwhile things with life. Here's another way to capture that thought. What's the point of fitness? What's fitness good for? And I want to suggest there's something pathological in the answer that says fitness is good for your next workout routine. Fitness is good for being able to spend more hours at the gym. That looks to me distorted. Now, we could talk about that in some other context. I go through it in the book, why I think that's distorted. But I think that we get to something similar when we're thinking about democracy. When democracy and our partisan allegiances within democratic politics shape and color and orchestrate everything we do together, not only do we become worse democratic citizens for the reasons that are tied to belief polarization, we do, but I think we also lose sight of the value of democracy. Because I want to suggest that, like fitness, part of democracy's value consists in its ability, when it's going well, to make available to us goods and pursuits and aspirations together that don't have anything to do with politics at all. Relationships of creativity, support, care, love, nurturing, that are made possible by politics, but don't have as their organizing principle our partisan objectives. When partisanship and our partisan political identities become, when they become the center of everything we do together, not only do we become less good at it, we lose sight of the point of what we're trying to do. That looks like a real tragedy to me.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on, I think what people feel, I think that what you're saying probably feels truthful to people in the sense of like evaluating their own lives and seeing that the partisan affiliation is sort of the thing that's put forth almost first in a friendship, in a romantic relationship, in a workplace, in a relationship with a colleague. It's almost like if that affiliation isn't there first, it's like, ooh, I don't know about this whole thing about working with this guy. I mean, definitely not going to date this woman because she's a crazy whatever. But people can feel like if they don't care about it to that extent, or they don't put it first, that there's some kind of like abdication of duty, like you're doing something wrong, and that's not in line with being a good democratic citizen. So when you're saying to saturate your environment, how do you answer to that like feeling of abdication of duty?
Well, just two things. One is I just want to just amplify the first part of what you said. Copartisanship is the most reliable predictor of success in online dating. As
an online dater myself, I have a history of online dating. I can say I'm not sure that I would swipe right on somebody who didn't have my same political views.
So it is now I am told, I don't know. I don't know this stuff. I've never even been on a dating app, but I'm told that it's now fairly standard advice to people engaging in online dating who want to maximize the expressions of interest, whatever swiping that means, to hide from their profile anything that might suggest a political valence. And so, if you want to maximize the number of people who are expressing interest, you don't stand in front of a flag, for example, or don't have a flag pin, an American flag pin, because these are cues that you're conservative, so on and so forth. Okay. By the way, one other point on this. Disapproving attitudes about cross-partisan marriage in the United States is now more intense than disapproval of interfaith or interracial marriage.
Because it has taken on that moral quality that you're doing something immoral. You're fraternizing with the enemy.
This is exactly right. So that brings us to the question, right? So what do you say to somebody who says, look, if I don't give every possible moment of my waking life to fighting for justice, I'm complicit, right? This is a more extreme version of the kind of response you're thinking of. And I think that is, or at least I know that is the resistance, at least from a certain kind of reader of Overdoing Democracy, or a certain kind of person who's heard me talk about this. That's the thing. It's like, there's so much injustice in the world. If I don't give everything I've got, I'm being permissive. I'm complicit. I'm taking undue advantage of my privilege, that these are not fights that I'm forced to be involved in. So I don't want to be inauthentic to my political self by taking a night off and playing Scrabble. I don't want to do that, because that's just letting evil win. Right? Okay. My response is just something very simple. I just say, okay, that's good. I understand that commitment to, and that concern with the authenticity of one's political project and aspiration, and I share it. Part of my argument, though, is that unless you recharge socially by engaging with others in activities that don't have a political valence, you become less good at serving your own political ends, because you become less capable of convincing people who are not already on board with you, because you become less able to hear their reasons and to communicate productively with them. And one other feature of the belief polarization phenomenon, which is the topic of the book I'm now working on, which is a follow-up to Overdoing Democracy, called Sustaining Democracy. Belief polarization also undermines our political allegiances in the following way. As we together, as like-minded, you and I, shift into our more extreme selves, we develop these more intensely negative attitudes to the people who are outside our allegiance. Our allyship becomes more intensely focused on our authenticity as committed members. We become more invested as a group in detecting posers. When we become more invested as a group in detecting posers, we find more posers, which is to say, the belief polarization phenomenon shrinks our coalitions. So if it's unchecked in the ways that I'm suggesting we need to check it, we actually become less effective as political agents. So that's another feature. The overdoing democracy, like the workaholic becomes less good at his job, right, or her job. When we're overdoing democracy, we become less good as democratic citizens, not merely in the fact that we're less able to work together with our opposition. We become less able to work efficiently together as allies. That disserves justice too. That's the argument. How's that?
I mean, I think it makes sense. I think I want to make sure that people understand. I think that we've done a good job outlining the problem. I think I want to make sure that people understand how they can apply the solution to their own life as far as desaturating their environments and learning the value of looking at people who are not their political allies still as people who have existences outside of being a democratic citizen who might vote one way or another. Mm-hmm. And one thing you do talk about is desaturating your social media feeds. Taking politics out of it might be one place. Yeah, you did have this line there. You said there's no dereliction of one's political duty in using social media strictly to look at videos of pets. I was like, yes, this is the solution that we have all been waiting for. Like, I could just watch cats and penguins or whatever on Facebook. I mean, I'm making light of it, but it really is like someone telling you that you can kind of drop it for a little while and that actually might be helpful is kind of a relief. Because I think people do feel like almost drowning in this stuff. And, you know, they do want to have good relationships with their families who might not share the same political beliefs that they do. And there's always this question I hear all the time, and you open your book with this of like, what am I going to do with Thanksgiving or Christmas? I have to talk to these people, you know? And it's like, well, maybe just take a break for a few hours.
And that there's something that strikes us as alien in that thought. But you know what? It's okay just to use social media to post pictures of cats and raccoons, as a friend of mine does. And there are the raccoon
is a pet or just wild raccoon?
There's a Twitter account just called Raccoons, and it's just videos of raccoons do it. And by the way, it's awesome, right? So that we find something remarkable, something deserving of comment or needing comment, in the idea that you can have a relationship with a person that's perfectly adequate, social, and all the rest, where their political values just are unknown to you because you talk about tennis. Or because you walk dogs together, right? That's totally fine. There's nothing lacking in that. There's no respect in which that's an incomplete relation. And enjoying that, seeking that kind of social connection outside of partisan identity, that there's, again, no dereliction of your duty in that. And in fact, if my argument is correct, that's contributing to your civic duty, is establishing and maintaining relations with others on grounds that have nothing to do with politics whatsoever. Insofar as that strains the imagination, we're overdoing democracy. We're being less good at it, and we're contributing to a political environment, and indeed a politics, a set of institutions and practices and laws that are less in line with a healthy democracy and justice than is possible.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a great ending note. Thank you so much for your time, Bob. And anyone watching this, if you want to get deeper into these arguments, there's a lot of different finer points of discussion that we didn't have time for. Definitely pick up the book, Overdoing Democracy. It's on our books page at the Progress Network. And you guys know how to use Google. You can always just Google it too. So, Bob, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's great to talk to you.
You too.